much. Hi, thank you. Hi, everybody. This is really odd that there's no PA, but I kind of also think it's cool. I'm like plugged directly into your brains. It's very interesting. It's a first. Okay, so I don't have that much time. Thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you to Copenhagen Health Week. Thank you to Peori for bringing me here. Very honored. So my name is Max Lugavere, and if you're not familiar with my work, I'll sort of walk you through it in as quick a way possible. I'm an author. I've written 3 books. I call it the Genius Trilogy, tackling the role of nutrition in brain health, nutrition in dementia prevention, and nutritional psychiatry, which is how mood is modulated, and various aspects of our cognitive function is modulated by our diets. I also got to contribute to the academic literature. In the middle of the screen, you'll see a chapter in a textbook that I got to co-author on the clinical practice of dementia prevention with some of my mentors in science. And then on the right side of the screen, you'll see my podcast. It's called The Genius Life. It's one of the top health podcasts in the world, and I'm very grateful for that. I also get to lecture globally on nutrition. I got to speak and provide a nutrition course for the Peterson Academy. I've been on the world's largest stages, the largest podcasts talking about the role of nutrition in brain health. And in the United States, I'm on some of the top TV shows talking about nutrition, making it actionable for mass audiences. And I recently got to speak at the U.S. Senate, bringing my advocacy to government. My most recent project is actually a documentary. So I've been working on this for the past 10 years, and it just came out last year. It's called Little Empty Boxes, and it's the first ever dementia prevention documentary. It was a labor of love, and it's about really my why, which is why I'm here today, and that is my mother. So my mom, at a very young age, developed a rare and incurable form of dementia called Lewy body dementia, and she is my why. She's why I do anything that it is that I do in this space, my advocacy, my science communication. Watching my mom succumb to this illness was earth-shattering for me, and so I've dedicated my life to understanding, to the best of my ability, given my non-academic background, the role of nutrition and lifestyle in modulating our risk for these awful conditions. Now, if you've spent any time on social media, or if you follow me, you know that one of the things that frustrates me greatly is the amount of fraud in our scientific apparatus. This was an expose that was published in 2022 that found a striking example of fraud that had dominated the Alzheimer's prevention space for decades. So a paper was published that misled Alzheimer's disease research for 16 years. Symbolizing billions of dollars of wasted money, misplaced hope, and the like. And this is not an isolated incident. Just last year, we learned that another top Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease researchers was accused of fraud and was then subject to academic leave. And so this is heartbreaking for anybody who's had a loved one with dementia, as I have, and it's done nothing but catalyze my passion for communicating this science to all who will listen. So one of the most shocking things that I learned early on in my journey is that dementia is a condition, it's a category of conditions that often begins years, if not decades, prior to the onset of symptoms. And when I began this research journey, as I mentioned about 10 years ago with my documentary, you couldn't even mention dementia and prevention in the same space, in the same sentence, without being called a fraud or fringe or a quack. But now we know, thanks to the most rigorous, best available, peer-reviewed evidence, that we do have a roadmap in terms of how you might live, how you might eat, to reduce, if not minimize, if not altogether prevent your ever succumbing to some of these conditions like Alzheimer's disease. So I'm going to focus today on the top modifiable risk factors. So when it comes to our risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, we have 3 what are called non-modifiable risk factors. So these are risk factors that you can't change, right? You can't change your age, you can't change your genes, and you can't change your gender, although some in the United States are debating the latter. Now, that sounds disempowering, right? But we have far more modifiable risk factors. We have 14 identified, as of 2024, modifiable risk factors. Now, early in life, we have 1, and that's less education, right? So early in life, the key modifiable risk factor that we have there is lower levels of education. But in midlife, here's where things start to get really interesting. We have about 10. So in midlife, we've got hearing loss, high LDL cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, hypertension, obesity, and excessive alcohol consumption. Now, I'm going to zoom in specifically on those that are modulated by diet because I happen to find nutrition fascinating. I'm a big nutrition nerd, and there's a lot of nutritional misinformation that I think part of my role here in this space is to debunk. And then in late life, we have social isolation, air pollution, which I'm going to talk about, and visual loss. When it comes to hearing loss and visual loss, the key things to remember are that being isolated from the external world reduces cognitive stimulation, and that's no bueno. But when it comes to what it is that we're eating, how we're living, there's a lot that we can do. Now, one of the key hypotheses that motivated my work in this space was a really sort of striking observation that I made in my own life. Now, again, I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have an advanced degree. I didn't come through the academic channels. I'm a journalist. And one of the earliest observations that I made as my mom was succumbing to this awful condition was that my maternal grandmother, so my mom's mom, lived until the age of 96, and she was cognitively healthy up until the very end. So my sort of working hypothesis, the lens through which I filtered every question, was what shifted in between my grandmother's generation and my mom's generation that led to my grandma being essentially protected from this disease and my mother developing it. And surely, when you look around the modern world, a lot has changed, right? But one of the most obvious changes has been to our food supply. Now, in the United States, you walk around your average supermarket, 73% of the items that you'll find are what food scientists are now referring to as ultra-processed foods. Now, I don't want to beat a dead horse. It's a saying that we have in the US, meaning, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about ultra-processed foods and their negative role in health. I'm going to touch on a few of them, but needless to say, our modern diets have become saturated by these foods. This is a wonderful photo project taken on by a photojournalist called What I Eat Around the World. And this is your weekly grocery haul from your average British family. So in the UK, they're doing a little bit better than we are in the United States, but still most of their weekly diet is dominated by ultra-processed foods, foods that you couldn't create in your own kitchen if you tried. So if you look around the scene, you have to essentially take a magnifying glass to find the perishable fresh food, right? You can see a few maybe fruits and vegetables in the center, but that's pretty much it. In the United States, we're doing far worse. So about 60% of the calories in the American diet come from ultra-processed foods. You can see mixed dishes like pizza and whatever, maybe a handful of grapes and tomatoes, but by and large, what most adults are consuming day in and day out for the, and providing the bulk of their calories are coming from what are essentially vending machine foods. Shelf-stable foods that are diluted of protein, rich in highly processed carbohydrates and fats, provide very little in the way of nutritional value, very little in the way of dietary fiber. And this is becoming a huge problem. We now have actually mounting data that wasn't even available when I wrote my first book, Genius Foods, showing that these kinds of foods are increasingly linked to pretty much every negative health outcome you can imagine. So this was a very telling updated meta-analysis and review that was published just last year in 2024 that found ultra-processed food consumption was linked to over 30 negative health outcomes. All of the obvious suspects were there, right? Obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, they were all there. Higher linearly dose response, the more ultra-processed foods consumed, the higher the risk for those conditions. But even the non-obvious ones non-obvious conditions are starting to be connected to our overconsumption of these foods. Anxiety, depression, and yes, dementia. Also worth noting in the previous study, they couldn't find one single positive health outcome associated with ultra-processed food consumption, not one single positive one. Now this study came out in 2022, so my first book, just to give you some context, came out in 2018, and I talked all about ultra-processed foods and their connection, the mechanistic plausibility through which they might be connected to conditions like Alzheimer's disease. But here we see it plain as day. Every 10% increment in ultra-processed foods consumed, we see a 25% increased risk for the diagnosis of dementia. And that is a statistically significant finding. Now, that is an observational finding, so correlation doesn't equal causation, but nonetheless, the evidence is strong. We see fairly convincing confidence intervals, and that dose response is further suggestive of causation. So what's the antidote? What is the antidote to our overconsumption of ultra-processed foods? Well, I've coined what I call the genius foods. Now, genius foods is not a scientific term. It's a term that I've invented, sort of like superfoods, which is more a marketing term than anything else. But I've done my best to highlight the foods that I think offer the most bang for the buck in terms of giving the brain what it needs, not just to survive, but to thrive. So dietary protein, I think, is one of the major levers in terms of optimizing health today. In fact, if I could offer one bit of advice to people that are confused about nutrition, it would be prioritize protein. Make dietary protein a priority in your diet. I know Emil, who spoke earlier, I recorded a podcast episode with him yesterday. I know he feels the same way. So this is an idea that's gaining, I think, momentum, not just in the United States, but increasingly in other countries as well. Many reviews point to the anti-obesity effect of consuming dietary protein. Here we can see that protein provides weight loss effects that are sustained, right? I mean, one of the problems with these GLP-1 drugs, which I know we don't want to talk too negatively about them because they're a big deal here, right? And they're increasingly a big deal around the world, right? Obesity is a real problem, and it increases your risk for a whole host of non-communicable chronic conditions, but you can boost GLP-1 with a high protein diet. We see both in the short term and the long term, protein helps prevent obesity because it's so satiating and it supports your skeletal muscle, which is crucial for maintaining metabolic health as you age, which is really important from a brain health standpoint. This is a study that found that prioritizing protein is safe. It doesn't increase mortality risk. And animal protein specifically, there's this dogma that we've been, spoon-fed over the past couple of decades that animal protein is bad, right? Here we actually see that it might actually provide a protective effect for cancer mortality, animal protein specifically. So not only does it not seem to be harmful from a cardiovascular standpoint, but it might actually provide a mild benefit for cancer protection. And again, this is also an observational study, but this is a large population cohort study, and so it is interesting. Here we see that long-term dietary protein intake, so long-term is important, right? Long-term dietary protein intake and subjective cognitive decline in the United States. Protein intake seems to be protective against cognitive decline. Now, again, this is observational, but when substituting carbohydrate-based energy and fat-based energy for protein energy, we seem to see a protective effect. Now, why might that be? Well, it's possible that dietary protein might actually reduce the atrophy rate of the hippocampus. So one of the salient features of most dementias, Alzheimer's disease in particular, is that we see global shrinkage of the brain. Total brain volume seems to atrophy. And that's because of the widespread neuronal death that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. We also see shrinkage in the hippocampus, which is the memory processing center of the brain. But here we see from this study, a higher intake of animal protein relative, in fact, to plant protein was linked to a lower atrophy rate in the hippocampus. And that's, again, one of the most vulnerable structures to be affected by Alzheimer's disease. Is this making sense so far, or am I going too fast? I just want to gauge, raise your hand if it's all checking out, making sense, tracking. Okay, cool. I know this is fast. This is one of my faster presentations, but I think this stuff is super important. This is a very large population cohort study out of the UK Biobank, which found that while processed meat was linked to an increased risk for dementia diagnosis, unprocessed red meat, 50 grams a day, every increment of 50 grams was associated with a reduced risk of all-cause dementia. So unprocessed red meat, I believe, is actually a health food. Now, when people talk about red meat, often what comes to mind is protein and fat, right? And specifically often protein and saturated fat. But red meat is not just protein and fat. Red meat contains myriad micronutrients that we know provide, at this point, a benefit to brain health. Micronutrients like creatine, micronutrients like vitamin E, which is a crucially important fat-soluble antioxidant. Micronutrients like choline, which actually used to be a B vitamin until we realized that we do actually synthesize a small amount of choline in our own bodies, but it still seems to be a conditionally essential nutrient, and 90% of adults on the standard American diet don't meet the adequate intake for choline every day. And choline provides not just a strong protective effect for our own brains, but provides a really valuable benefit to our offspring as well. Studies show that when mothers-to-be consume higher levels of choline in their diets, their children actually appear smarter and have more developed cognitive faculties. This study found, this was actually a Finnish study, found that the highest consumers among men of phosphatidylcholine, which is a specific form of choline found primarily in egg yolks, had a 30% risk reduction for the diagnosis of dementia over 22 years, regardless of whether or not they carried the most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene, the ApoE4 allele. So phosphatidylcholine, found most abundantly in egg yolks, the highest egg yolk consumers seem to have a pretty significant 28% risk reduction for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And to further support that observation, this study came out just last year that found that regular egg consumption, so eggs themselves, the consumption of eggs themselves, about 1 to 2 eggs a week was all it took. They saw a 50% risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease. Now, again, I just want to underscore that these are all observational studies. We don't have very many randomized controlled trials to prove cause and effect, in this regard, in the field of nutrition, let alone the field of dementia prevention, but all super interesting stuff. And in tandem with that, it is very easy to find observational data that shows the opposite, right? That shows that meat is unhealthy. In fact, our dietary guidelines in the United States have long been dominated by, this fear-mongering around foods like red meat and even egg yolks, because, again, it is easy to find links in the observational literature that make foods like red meat appear bad, right? Linked to negative health outcomes. Well, that's where I think a little bit of science literacy goes a long way. And a lot of those negative health outcomes that we see associated with red meat consumption can be attributed often to what's referred to as healthy user bias. Now, this slide is actually, I think, one of the best examples of healthy user bias, where you can see that even higher levels of unprocessed red meat co-varies with higher body mass index, with a higher likelihood of smoking, with a higher likelihood of hypertension, diabetes, with lower levels of physical activity. You can see in the red outlines are the boxes of the highest tiers of unprocessed red meat and processed red meat. And you can see most clearly on the processed meat side, right? Because processed meat consumers are fast food consumers. So people who consume a lot of processed meat, while it's obvious that their health is going to be poor, is it due to the processed red meat? We don't actually know. It could be due to the fact that these are obviously fast food consumers. Processed red meat, where does that typically lie, right? Hot dogs, hamburgers, chicken nuggets, things like that. Those are the most obvious places. But even unprocessed red meat co-varies with lower socioeconomic status in one's neighborhood. So we always have to be really cautious when interpreting observational data. This applies across the board. This applies even to foods that we know are beneficial from randomized control trials, like vegetables and whole grains, right? People who eat more vegetables also are more likely to exercise, more likely to take a multivitamin. So we just always have to be cognizant of that. And of course, researchers do understand this as well, and they try their best to adjust for all this stuff, but it's impossible to adjust for all of the variables that make up a healthy lifestyle, right? It's just impossible. So healthy user bias, the devil's in the details. Does that make sense? Cool. Another food that I find to be incredibly protective of brain health, and this is sort of an obvious one, but it's wild fatty fish like salmon, sardines, mackerel, herring, great sources of omega-3 fatty acids. We see in red blood cells that higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids are associated with specifically DHA, which is one of the primary structural building blocks of the brain. The higher the level of DHA that we have in our blood cells, the more dramatically our risk seems to be reduced for Alzheimer's disease. Now, everybody knows that fish is healthy, right? Fish is good for you. It's one of the, you could ask the most orthodox nutrition expert, right? But even so, this is still an observational study. So we always have to check our biases. People who eat more fish, again, might be more health conscious. But all that being said, this is a compelling study because we actually look at blood levels and as opposed to food frequency questionnaires, which is usually how nutritional research is sort of done. And we see that that association is maintained. Now, for as much as I talk about red meat and fish and animal source foods, I'm not a carnivore dieter. I actually strongly believe that plant foods, whole plants, are beneficial to brain health. So one of my favorite category of foods are dark leafy greens. Now, observational data shows that people who eat dark leafy greens regularly have more youthful brains. So this is a study, an observational study from Rush University. Actually, the first author in the study, Martha Claire Morris, the late, great Martha Claire Morris, she passed away a couple of years ago, but she's one of the preeminent nutrition dementia researchers and has coined the MIND diet. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the MIND diet. It's one of the more rigorously studied dietary patterns to reduce risk for dementia and Alzheimer's disease. What she found was that people who eat 1.3 servings of dark leafy greens a day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger, the equivalent of being 11 years younger in age when people consume 1.3 servings of dark leafy greens a day. So that's a recommendation that I make in Genius Foods, to just eat a salad a day. It's a very easy way to check off myriad nutritional boxes. Now, as I mentioned, this is an observational study, right? But is there biological plausibility, right? How might dark leafy greens actually boost brain health, right? Well, dark leafy greens are the top source of compounds called carotenoids. So carotenoids are plant pigments. You might be familiar with beta-carotene. But two of the most important, actually, for brain health specifically, and eye health, are lutein and zeaxanthin. So if you look at any eye health supplement, chances are you're going to find lutein and zeaxanthin. We now know that these same carotenoids, which give dark leafy greens and other vegetables their yellow and orange hues, they also accumulate in the brain, where they support cognitive function. They boost neural efficiency. They protect the brain from oxidative stress. Kale is the top source. Spinach comes second. Swiss chard. So we know that these compounds at this point are very protective of brain health. We have randomized controlled trials. We have observational studies. Studies show that people that are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease have about 50% less levels, 50% lower levels of these carotenoids in their brains. So I think dark leafy greens are fantastic for that reason. Another reason why they're amazing is that they're the top source of inorganic nitrates. So nitrates are compounds in vegetables like spinach, kale, arugula is actually the top source, that support the body's nitric oxide pathways. So nitric oxide is this crucially important gas produced in our blood vessels, in the endothelium of our blood vessels, that opens up our blood vessels, provides a vasodilatory effect, and enhances blood flow, and helps to normalize blood pressure. So we've actually found that high blood pressure, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the key modifiable risk factors in midlife for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So you want to make sure that you don't have high blood pressure, and consuming dark leafy greens is a great way to help support healthy blood pressure because it provides inorganic nitrate. Now, interestingly, we rely on oral bacteria to reduce inorganic nitrate to nitrite, which is then what enters this very complicated nitric oxide pathway. And oral bacteria, bacteria on our tongues, are crucial for this conversion process. Now, unfortunately, a huge proportion of the world's population regularly rinses with antiseptic mouthwash, essentially nuking the bacteria on in our mouths that play a cardioprotective role when we consume these types of vegetables, right? Here we see observational data linking the frequent use of antiseptic mouthwash, even over-the-counter mouthwash, to heightened risk for hypertension, again, which increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease, and type 2 diabetes. So we want to avoid antiseptic mouthwash. It's a very smart thing to do if you care about your brain, if you care about cardiovascular health, etc. The primary oil that you should be using if you want to protect your brain is extra virgin olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil is the hallmark fat used in the Mediterranean dietary pattern, adherence to which is associated with a robust risk reduction for Alzheimer's disease. And olive oil use itself, here we see that all it takes is 7 grams a day of extra virgin olive oil, which led to a 28% reduced risk for dementia. There's no drug at the pharmacy that's going to slash your risk by 30%. But it seems to be the case that 7 grams a day of extra virgin olive oil is all it takes. And part of that has to do with the fact that extra virgin olive oil has these very powerful anti-inflammatory polyphenols in it. So, and that makes it unique, by the way, among dietary oils. Here we have a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials showing us that yes, extra virgin olive oil does have anti-inflammatory effects. It's almost like medicine. So we want to prioritize extra virgin olive oil. Be mindful, of course, of its calorie density. It's still an oil, which is one of our most calorie-dense foods. It's like jet fuel, actually. But it should be the primary oil used in the kitchen. Another food that I think is fantastic and offers a lot of bang for the buck in terms of its nutrient density, specifically where the brain is concerned, are avocados. I was very pleased to see at my hotel this morning. We're a long way from Mexico, but nonetheless, we had guacamole at breakfast. It was great. Here we see observational data linking regular avocado consumption to better cognition. Across every cognitive domain measured, avocado consumption was linked to better cognition. And that included actually guacamole. So I don't know if you have Chipotle here. In the United States, they always ask you, Chipotle costs extra. Do you still want it? Yes, it's worth the investment for your brains, yes. So an avocado a day, might keep the neurologist away. So I only have a few more minutes, and unfortunately the next section deserves a lot more time than that, but I just want to touch on it because this is a rapidly evolving field of research, and we didn't have this data just a couple of years ago. Now, as I mentioned, my mom had a condition called Lewy body dementia, which actually has more in common with Parkinson's disease than it does Alzheimer's disease. And we're now starting to see the role of environmental toxin exposure in Parkinson's etiology. Parkinson's disease has long been a very mysterious condition, but we're now a picture is starting to emerge in terms of also how we might live to reduce our risk for that condition as well. So you want to avoid toxic exposures. Also, I don't want it to be lost on this audience that this is actually a headline in a peer-reviewed medical journal. Parkinson's disease is a predominantly environmental disease. This is a hypothesis, but published in the Journal of Parkinson's disease. Very interesting stuff. So we want to prioritize organic for certain products. We definitely want to be mindful of air quality, and we want to drink clean water. So this was a study that was found in the United States. They found that proximity of one's home to golf courses was associated with a dramatically increased risk for, or may have been associated with a dramatically increased risk for Parkinson's disease. We need more research to confirm whether or not this link truly exists. But needless to say, on golf courses, they spray a lot of chemicals. And it's thought that those chemicals, whether they're volatile organic compounds or are able to leach into the groundwater, that people who drink from water wells are putting themselves at increased risk of exposure to chemicals that are sprayed on golf courses. And many of these chemicals, herbicides and pesticides like paraquat, like others, have been not just linked directly to Parkinson's disease in observational literature, but in animal models can literally create Parkinson's disease in mice and other mammals. So you want to make sure that you're drinking clean water. You want to be mindful of the pipage through which your water is flowing. Or, any type of filter is better than nothing probably. And to be fair, I'm not familiar with the water quality here in Denmark. But at least in the United States, any type of filter is better than none, reverse osmosis purification being the most thorough. You want to prioritize organic for certain products. Now, I'll be the first to admit organic is not perfect, but it does reduce your exposure. It doesn't eliminate your exposure, but it does reduce your exposure to synthetic herbicides and pesticides. Industrial agriculture is a problem. There's a lot of good to be gained from it, obviously, to feed a large, growing population. But by nature of how industrial ag is performed, at least in the United States, there is the potential for cross-contamination, migration of synthetic herbicides and pesticides. But you are reducing your exposure by consuming organic when we're talking about berries, where you eat the peel or the rind or the entire leaf. So you want to prioritize organic for certain products. Many believe that organic is actually worth it with regards to animal source foods as well, because some of these products bioaccumulate up the food chain. That I think remains to be seen with clarity. But also in the United States, wheat, oats, certain grains, we use herbicides and pesticides as a desiccant to dry these grains out. I don't believe that they do that here. I know that that's illegal in Italy, but in the United States at least, and for grains and whatever that we export, we use glyphosate, for example, as a means of drying out rapidly various grain products. And you also want to be mindful of air quality. This is crucially important. And again, this is an area where I've evolved. This was not on my radar 6 years ago when my first book came out. The nose is the front door to the brain. When we inhale compounds, particulate matter, through our noses, it connects directly to the olfactory bulb in the brain. And compounds that enter the brain via that axis bypass the blood-brain barrier, which is this selective membrane that normally keeps toxins and other stuff that we don't want in our brains out, right? But when we breathe in stuff through our nose, as you can see here, those compounds are able to access the brain, and that might be one of the reasons why dysfunction of our sense of smell is one of the earliest preclinical signs of cognitive decline. So there is thinking that Parkinson's disease might actually begin in that region of the brain. So we just want to be careful. As I mentioned, air pollution is a newly identified modifiable risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. It is very likely implicated in Parkinsonism as well. So we just want to be careful of our exposure to air pollution. A study came out very recently in the United States. It was a randomized control trial that found that just having air purifiers, HEPA air purifiers in the home. This was a crossover trial where basically subjects serve as their own controls. Found that just doing that, set it and forget it, led to a small but significant improvement in blood pressure, because some of these toxins that we inhale through our noses can actually stimulate our immune system and lead to heightened blood pressure. So it's all very fascinating stuff. But all that is to say, genes are not destiny. With every choice that you make, you may be, swaying your destiny in the direction of disease or conversely away from it. So I hope this was helpful for you guys and illuminating. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much. And I'm going to be doing a book signing with my friends at Piori right after this. So come and say hello, take some photos, grab a book. I just want to say thank you to Copenhagen Health Week for having me, and thank you, of course, to Piori for bringing me out. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.